We are a club deeply rooted in history. Nobody can ever accuse the Empire Club of not being ahead of the curve when it comes to current affairs of this nation. It was only this past Wednesday that the Premier of Ontario appointed former Prime Minister Paul Martin to investigate the feasibility of an Ontario pension plan. Today's talk is about pensions. Financial security is the means to many of our necessities of life. We are a nation that is concerned with the welfare of our fellow citizens. In 1963, at this very podium, the Right Honourable Lester B. Pearson, Prime Minister of Canada, outlined his vision for the Canada Pension Plan. The Prime Minister believed that all Canadians, regardless of means, should be entitled to a basic pension, bridging the distance between dependence and dignity. To introduce our speakers today, please welcome Mr. Tom Clowett, Chief Executive Officer of the TMX Group. Tom.
Thank you, Noble, and good afternoon, everybody. Since 1903, the Empire Club has played an important role in national and international debate. If a subject matter is important, we know that at some point it's going to be discussed right here at this forum by people who really know the subject and what's going on. Now, there are a few more timely issues to discuss than today's subject, our pension system. I'm truly privileged to have the chance to introduce today's speakers. Jacquie McNish is a senior writer with the Globe and Mail, and you'll also recognize her from her work as a host on BNN. Jacquie is an award-winning business journalist. She has won 6 national newspaper awards and is the author of now 3 best-selling books. She also teaches a seminar on investor rights and shareholder activism at Osgoode Hall Law School, and it's great to have Jacquie here to share her insights with us today. Alongside Jacquie, we have another familiar face to many of us, Jim Leech. Jim retired as president and CEO just a few weeks ago after more than 12 years at the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, one of the largest pension funds in the country and a major investor worldwide. Jim's career highlights include leadership roles in the realm of private equity, as well as several public companies. His experience is spread across a broad spectrum of the Canadian business landscape at each phase of a company's life cycle. Jim has led a merchant bank, an integrated energy and pipeline company, and he has helped technology startups navigate through the challenging early stages of development. Both of our 2 guests have led distinguished and unique careers. But what brought Jacquie and Jim together, and ultimately brought them here today, is a topic that is very important: the stage following your career, retirement. Jacquie and Jim have co-authored a very compelling and a very important book called The Third Rail, which pulls back the curtain on the pension situation in this country. In the book, they expose some sobering facts, and most importantly, they do so in a constructive manner. The pension issues inevitably impacts the lives and careers of all Canadians. Unfortunately, it is also a problem that few are willing to face, and one that fewer still have the temerity to solve. Tackling this subject matter is an enormous challenge, but Jim and Jacquie have done just that, and importantly, raised the quality of the discussion along the way. So with that, I will let them tell you more about the book, the hard lessons we need to learn, and importantly, the necessary steps we need to take to work our way through this problem. Jim and Jacquie, thank you.
First time we've talked about pensions sitting in thrones.
Thank you very much, Tom, and I feel a bit awkward with the, but thank you, head table. We're going to carry on this as a bit of a discussion and leave a bunch of time at the end for questions, so save up your questions. We found in previous sessions that the question and answer period is the people really get into it. Before we kick off, I have to, it's an unabashed crass commercial on behalf of our publisher. He left one of these on your table and says if you want a place to put it, you just need to get one of these. And they are available outside or, of course, online. Enough commercials. The little bit of background and motivation for this book was frustration that both of us had back in 2012 as we saw the pension debate start to evolve and felt that it was really focused in the wrong areas. It was focused on things such as pension envy. It was focused on this fruitless debate of defined benefit versus defined contribution, and felt that this really was more a story of people arriving at retirement with insufficient savings, and particularly in an environment where longevity keeps increasing and interest rates and returns are low. So we set out to write The Third Rail to be a book dedicated or aimed at educated Canadians who are they want to engage in the debate, but they're a bit bewildered, overwhelmed, frightened by the whole subject. And so we wanted to try and make it simple. It's 180 pages, small format, large print. If it takes you 3.5 hours to read it, you're kind of slow. And it's written as a series of short stories. It's not an economic tome. There are no charts and graphs and tables, etc. So it's quite. Even my children said it was quite engaging, and that's a compliment. So anyway, pensions are on the top of the agenda these days. They're on the verge of becoming very significant election issues. They're dominating and have dominated the politics and elections in the 3 jurisdictions that we call out here. That's New Brunswick, the Netherlands, and Rhode Island. And as Tom mentioned, it's probably going to become an issue in the next Ontario election, if not the next Canadian election. And why is that? Well, it's a simple fact that 40% of our workforce, some 7 million workers, will be retiring in the next 20 years. And generally speaking, they haven't saved enough. 60% of our workforce today do not have workplace pensions. RRSPs have been a dismal failure. People are living far longer than they ever expected, and many of our existing pension plans are not sustainable. So it's up to our business, our labor, and our political leaders to grab the third rail. We called it the third rail because that's, of course, the electrified rail in the subway that everybody is afraid to touch because you'll get killed if you touch it. But it is time that our leadership does grab that third rail and start confronting this issue.
So Jim has talked about the leadership vacuum that exists in Canada and in many other countries. It is a career killer. That's the perception politically. We are starting to see this change when there are more urgent and pressing pension crises in various regimes that we discuss in the book. So what happens to the debate when there's a leadership vacuum? We strongly believe it's badly misinformed, and it's defined today in Canada and many other countries by pension envy. 60% of Canadians don't have pensions. The majority of those that do are public sector workers. Taxpayers feel that they shouldn't be there. You've got younger generations. We've got young students from Centennial College here. I wish you luck. You'll be propping up a lot of pensions of older people that if we don't change things, you won't be getting. And there's intergenerational risk there. So you have the haves and the have-nots. And the best way that I can tell you about what this means, what that debate means and how misinformed it is a fable that I heard when I was in Central Islands. One of the chapters and case studies we do is in Rhode Island, which really was in crisis state. It had gone over the cliff as a result of the pension deficits. And in Central Falls, they declared bankruptcy, and it became a very ugly situation between the taxpayers and the pensioners, most of them police workers, fire workers, and municipal workers. And the taxpayers had seen their property taxes rise as the city coped to deal with this, not by rolling back the benefits or creating a more sustainable pension system. They cut services, they raised taxes, the taxpayers were done. And I met this woman who had been a consultant in Russia with McKinsey & Co. for years, came back to her home state, Rhode Island, and said, I thought Russia was messy. This place is really messy. And she said, I heard a fable once that best describes what happened here with the pension crisis. And if you know anything about Russian fables, they love the golden fish. The golden fish is a magical creature in the fables. And the fable goes like this. A poor farmer only has one cow. It's just him and his wife beating out a very meager existence, and one day the cow dies. He's distraught. His livelihood has disappeared. His wife says, I can't take this anymore. Stop the kvetching, go out and go fishing. And he goes fishing, and lo and behold, he pulls up a golden fish. And the golden fish says, I'm a golden fish. I can grant you any wish you want. What would you like? Please save my life, and you will get this wish. So he thinks about it for a long time, and then kind of a nasty smile crosses his face. And he says, I know what I want. I want my neighbor's cow to die. That's the pension debate today. That is the most dominant pension debate. And the people here know this because they know that they want to take away the public sector defined benefit because they don't have it. They feel that their taxpayers are only paying for it. Jim got me hooked in this book because he told me how wrong that thinking was, and in fact, how the math just doesn't add up. So this is part where I'm going to hand the conversation over to Jim, and he's going to tell you why that farmer in Russia is wrong.
The book concludes with 3 recommendations, but I'll tackle the first one that Jackie's thrown out as a challenge, and that is this, as I called it before, this fruitless debate between defined benefits and defined contributions. And one of the points we make is that we need to stop this migration that's gone on from defined benefit to defined contribution. And why is that? It is irrefutable mathematically that the defined benefit structure for a pension plan is far less expensive than the defined contribution structure. Now that is probably piercing a whole bunch of urban myths because in many quarters defined benefit's bad and defined contribution is good. It's really a question of where the risk is placed, but mathematically it is far less expensive to have a defined benefit plan. And the reason for that is that you can pool all sorts of risks, investment risk, but more particularly the longevity risk. So in a defined benefit plan, such as the Ontario teachers or others, we need to save up enough money to get to the actuarial mean of when it's predicted that people will die. If you're in a defined contribution plan, it's every man for himself, and you basically have your own little account, and you must save enough money to last to the very far right-hand side of that actuarial curve. Because if you're going to live to be 105, you don't want to run out of money when you're 102, because the last 3 years won't be a lot of fun. So so we spend a fair amount of time in the book piercing that urban myth and explaining that the defined benefit model is the superior model. However, that's not to say that we defend the stereotypical 1970s defined benefit plan that was built. There needs to be a far more appropriate sharing of risk and cost as between the sponsor, aka the employer, and the employee. So we talk about target benefit plans, we talk about hybrids, we talk about evolved plans. That's what we're talking about, is moving, keeping the basic structure of defined benefits because it's so efficient and effective, but introducing a risk-sharing concept. So just some fast statistics, too, about the defined benefit plans that we picked up in our research. Interestingly enough, recipients today in Canada, there's approximately $68 to $72 billion paid to retirees from the existing defined benefit plans. Those retirees pay somewhere between $14 and $16 billion in taxes. Everyone always thinks that the dollar that goes out on a pension is kind of lost, but they pay that in taxes. And they spend in the economy somewhere between $56 and $63 billion. Every small community in Ontario, approximately 11% of the income of every small community in Ontario is the income of a defined benefit pension recipient. So it's a huge component of our economy. One last fact before I turn it back to Jackie is in looking at the defined benefit model, there's always this perception that, the taxpayer is paying for this, et cetera. The facts of the matter are that around, somewhere between 20 and 25% of the dollar that goes out as a pension payment comes from contributions. So in the case of teachers, half of that, so 12.5 cents so it's approximately 12 cents comes from the teacher who paid in, and 12 comes from the employer. The balance, 75 to 80%, comes from the investment return. So it's a very, very efficient model. The alternative is the guaranteed income supplement and the old age security payments. And those come out of general revenues. That comes right out. Every dollar comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. And right now, OAS and GIS represents the single largest line item in the federal government's budget. It's $38 billion. And by every projection, it will triple in the next 16 years. So that's what we're trying to avoid.
So Jim's given you some very important numbers sort of lay out the landscape. We can either deal with it now or deal with it later and pay more as taxpayers. Pensions are more than numbers. Pensions are about people. And what we discovered in doing our research for the 3 case studies, New Brunswick, Rhode Island, and Netherlands, is that it takes people to fix this problem, and it's the people who are affected by this problem. And in each of these regimes, we discovered extraordinary people. Outliers, mavericks, who are willing to approach this from a very different point of view, who overcame hurdles, biases, and resistance, constant resistance, to do what needed to be done. And the first one I'm going to tell you about is New Brunswick in our backyard. New Brunswick is what we call the ground zero in Canada's pension crisis because the children of the baby boomers, they left a long time ago. This is a have-not province, resource-based. They had to leave the province to get jobs. And so we're having the pension crisis hit New Brunswick faster than any other province in the country. You layer in the crisis with pulp and paper and other resources, it's a grim situation. Financial crisis hits, and the province of New Brunswick is looking at a downgrading. And you know what a downgrade means to a government. It's just going to cost them a lot more to pay for everything. The extraordinary thing about New Brunswick is that, yes, they were heading towards a cliff. They had public sector pensions they could no longer afford. The people who were the catalyst for the reform were the unions, and they worked with the Conservative Premier, which is truly an extraordinary thing if you think about it. It involves one nursing union and one hospital workers union, where they were looking after the 2008 financial crisis at potentially, I may get my numbers slightly wrong, I believe a 60% increase in their contributions or up to a 50% reduction in their benefits. So they were looking at not retiring when they hoped to, and massive reduction in their benefits. So there are a lot of complicated ins and outs in terms of what they did in the courts and the jurisdictions, but they worked with David Alward, the Premier of New Brunswick, and they resolved this problem. And David did something very interesting. He made it voluntary for the various public sector unions and groups to come in on if they wanted to, rather than ramming it down their throats. So it was a sort of a fairly calculated move because they knew that they needed help, and if they wanted to be part of this model, they were going to have to come in. It's still a fight. It still grabs the headlines in New Brunswick, but more and more of the public sectors groups are coming in, and at the end of the day, what do they have? They have what Jim referred to as a shared risk model. If you are underfunded under the shared risk model, the beneficiaries, the members of the pension fund, give up benefits. The quid pro quo in this relationship is solvency. You can no longer be underfunded. You have to be fully funded. There's just no wiggle room like there is today for many funds. So the worker gets the security of a more sustainable pension plan and levers for the employer to temporarily suspend such benefits at cost of living if they can't afford it, if they're underfunded.
My favorite part of the book is the Rhode Island story, and the character there is, as Jackie said, it's about people. And the lead character is a young woman who's the state treasurer. Her name is Gina Raimondo. She grew up in a poor family in Rhode Island, went to public school, took the bus, studied at the libraries, etc., went to Yale, Harvard, and Oxford, came back, had a successful venture capital operation on Wall Street, and she read in the paper about buses being lined, or routes being closed and libraries being closed, etc. And she said, people will not be able to live the American dream that I did unless that's fixed. And so she left her job, decided to run as a neophyte, never run before, on a platform of pension reform. She was advised against it by everybody in the Democratic Party, right up to the White House. But she did it, and she won in a landslide. And she produced a document called Truth in Numbers, and she held countless number of sometimes very hostile town hall meetings, explaining it in a very dispassionate way, how a reform is required, etc., and eventually got it through their legislature, even though the governor didn't necessarily support it to begin with. Interesting name, keep it in the back of your mind. You'll probably see her run as governor, and I wouldn't be surprised if you see her in some capacity in the White House in the future. This is a real dynamo and someone who had the guts to grab the third rail with both hands.
One of the things we learned from meeting with Gina Raimondo was that how she dealt with what is arguably the toughest political issue, or for an employer as well, in the pension debate, and that is it's immoral to change the terms of the contract. And she would look the very angry retirees and union leaders in the eyes and said, no, it's immoral to close the schools, to stop the buses. So it's a very interesting approach. They were in crisis. It's not going to be the same for everyone. Jim is about to give you his top 3 reform proposals, which truly are the heart and soul of the book. I want everyone to think about questions. You have a unique opportunity here to talk to one of the country's best experts in pensions. We've had very robust discussions with every group we've talked to, and we hope that you folks will continue that tradition. And here comes the top 3.
So the last chapter has the 3 recommendations. The very first has to do with our concern for people who are earning $30,000 to $100,000 a year. If they're depending on Canada Pension Plan, OAS, and GIS, they're in for a big shock in how their standard of living will change. And so our recommendation is for a modest increase in Canada Pension Plan. There are all sorts of different models that have been put forward. We mentioned one that we think works in the book, but we're not wedded to it, which would see contributions to Canada Pension Plan phased in over time increase from about $2,300 to about $2,900. So we don't believe that that's a huge hit, and is basically aimed at people who are at an income level well above the average of the workers whose employers are members of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, so it shouldn't really impact them that dramatically. The second one is what I talked about before, is to stop this foolhardy migration from defined benefit to defined contribution, but see an evolution to the standard defined benefit program so that indeed you have something that is sustainable and secure for employees. And our third, really, it tries to address the 60% of Canadians who do not have workplace pensions. And the federal government and most of the provinces are picking up on a new plan called PRPP, but we think it needs to get changed. There need to be some different elements added to that, because we don't think it'll work as it is. It's just another four-letter word, as opposed to RRSP, which we know has been a huge failure. So in in this recommendation, we would see that contributions and membership would be mandatory, because people will not save if it is voluntary. Secondly, there needs to be far greater emphasis on cost control and keeping the costs of administering and managing the pensions, which likely means larger pools. And then the third, which is the fact that in a defined contribution model, you don't find out how much money you have to live until the very last day. So the very last day when you retire, you open the box, and that tells you find out how much money you've got for the rest of your life. We believe that, say, starting around age 40, that some portion of your defined contribution savings need to get annuitized into deferred life annuities, so that when you get to that magic day, as I did 24 days ago, you do know that you've got a certain amount that's guaranteed for the rest of your life. And it takes that anxiety out of the equation. So those are our three recommendations. We don't think they're terribly revolutionary. This subject has been studied time and time again. It's now time to take action.
And with that, we're going to open up the floor to questions. I believe there are 2 roving wireless microphones over there, so if you raise your hand if you've got a question, please feel free.
Thanks very much. I've read the book, enjoyed it a lot. 2 questions relating to time and time contribution. First of all, can you imagine a way that time contributions can be switched back? You know that someone's always switched over. And can you talk a bit about the tax structure, which currently doesn't make it possible for a DC plan member to save the same percentage shelf in a DB? Do you think that has to move up the agenda in terms of urgency?
Yeah, we spend some time in the book, not a lot of time, talking about the fact that regulatory and tax rules have really not kept pace with what needs to get done. There are some examples. They're small and very few of organizations that move from defined benefit over to defined contribution and then now have moved back. And that was driven, by economics, but just as much by bifurcation of your workforce. I mean, it's a huge HR issue. Unfortunately, many of the decisions, the DB to DC conversion, are driven out of the treasurer's office. And the HR department hasn't had an awful lot to say in it. And there's now growing evidence that having a bifurcation in your workforce is not healthy. You really do set up the haves and the have-nots. With regard to tax and regulation, yes, a lot of work has to be done. At the present time, our RSP limit is effectively 18%, so to speak. And in defined contribution plans are basically limited to that. In many defined benefit plans, they've had authorization from the tax department to go above that because contributions had to rise above that 9% level. So that has to get balanced out and rationalized somewhere along the way.
One of the things that we learned along the way, and we only highlight some of the reforms, but there are lots of things you can do with defined contributions to make them much more effective. They're all segregated, or typically segregated if you're a defined contribution member, which means that you're paying into depending on an inefficient system where you're paying rates of 1%, 2%, 3% depending on the program, and in a low interest rate environment, you know how much of a return you're going to make on a system like that. And one of the things that other jurisdictions, for example, Britain is doing, is pooling the defined contribution plans, either for industries, sectors, or for companies. And if you pool and if you create a mini Ontario Teachers or a mini OMERS, you significantly reduce your fees. I mean, what are the fees, the fee rate on Ontario teachers? It's less than?
Costs us less than half a point.
Less than half a point, which is a dramatic savings, can amount to, you know, for an individual, tens of thousands of dollars over the lifetime of their plan. And you pool it, you get professional management, and you spread that longevity risk that Jim was talking about. So once again, there are a lot of these programs and reforms that are out there. Are we going to act on it?
Do you think it was a good or bad decision by the Ontario government to pursue their own pension reform?
Oh, boy.
Are you listening?
Where's Ken? Where's Ken? My personal view on it is that it would be far more efficient and effective to follow our first recommendation, which is a modest increase in the Canada Pension Plan. For all sorts of political reasons, that does not seem to be a road to go down. I think it's a second best solution. I think the critical mass is here that it can work, but I think it's a second best solution. And my sense is that's where the Ontario government is too, that it's a second best solution, but it's a solution to a problem that they see is very real. And who knows what happens, you know, maybe other jurisdictions, other provinces will join in. You know, look to me in the debate, and I'm not close to it, I'm just reading it in the newspaper that Jacquie writes, you know, basically all the provinces are there, varying degrees, debating amount and time, and so maybe they'll get together and do it themselves. But it would be a shame if we have to end up there, but at least the government is realized it's a problem and is doing something about it, so I laud them for that.
Thank you very much for touching the third rail. Jim, I'd like to follow up a little bit on what you just said about amount and time for your first recommendation. Certainly we saw over 40,000 lost jobs in the last employment report. Small and medium-sized businesses concerned about increasing hydro costs, things like that. The time element, where do you think, certainly your book expresses urgency, but how quickly or how much could this be phased in over a period of time? Would you have a recommended time frame for phasing in the adjustment?
I don't have one. We haven't been privy to any studies that would show how quickly it can or should be done. But I mean, if you picked a decade, I mean, it's probably a good starting point to say, is it shorter or longer? But it's kind of around that period of time. The interesting thing about pensions is you're dealing in long time horizons. These kids are going to live. They got a better than average chance of living till they're over 100. And so you're dealing with those type of time frames. So small changes today amplify over that period quite dramatically. So it's a matter of getting started, and that's the important thing. It is so easy to kick this down the road to the next administration, et cetera. And it really needs to be, you have to need to start doing it now. 20 years ago, we were, as a society, saving, around 20 to 20.5% was the national savings rates. Today, it's like 5.5. I mean, it's not enough. We've got to get savings up. So I don't view this as a tax. This is savings, and those savings get turned right back into the economy as investments. I mean, you take a look at the 10 largest defined benefit pension plans in this country. They control around $800 billion, which is invested in government bonds, private enterprise, venture capital, everything in this country, and creating tons of jobs. So it's not this concept that we'll take a dollar more into CPP and it disappears into the stratosphere somewhere is just ill-founded.
The other thing is that the reforms that we wrote about, the two regions, Rhode Island and New Brunswick, but particularly Rhode Island, I mean, their reforms, you know, were forged in the crucible of a crisis. And you talk about Central Falls, what happened to those pensioners? They lost up to 55% of their pensions. And most of those people were retirees. That meant selling their homes, going back to work. Do we want to wait for that? Because that's when often our politicians feel that it's safe to go there. So do we want to wait for that? We will be the ones paying if we don't.
Excuse me. I'm speaking.
Get all choked up on this subject.
Yeah. Well, I'm a member of the Freedom 95 crowd, as you know. But no, you did answer part of my question earlier, but on behalf of the kids over there, I mean, I've been in the investment business long enough to know that the real compounding is in the fourth decade. And, but I mean, the longevity risk is a longevity opportunity, which you've alluded to. How big is the leverage if we get started? Because you've crawled through the plumbing of these numbers. I have to believe that longevity is a huge asset card to play in the equation. And if people can be made more aware of that, that should help the debate to take the short-term pain. But I just have no sense of, you know, what kind of difference that extra time we're all going to have.
Well, it's enormous. If I go back to 1970, it's interesting, and I'll use teachers as an example because I know those numbers. In 1970, the actuarial report at the time said that teachers would work so many years, and then they would retire for so many years, and that the investment return would be such. And when you look at that compared to today, they were basically dead on with their projection on how long teachers would work. And they were basically dead on what the returns would be. And they were out by 60% on how long they were going to live on retirement. I mean, they said they're going to live in retirement for 20 years, and they're living in retirement for 32. Okay, so that's another 12 years.
You're not dying fast enough. That's the crisis.
Yeah. That's right. And it's, you know, I mean, it's interesting. You were talking about the moral debate about breaking a contract, et cetera. And I was in a session where there was a very frustrated, angry union leader who was basically saying, you know, but what you're talking about is, you know, breaking that contract, breaking the promise. And I said, I'm being facetious, but I did say, you know, I understand, but you also broke the contract. And there was great excitement. And I said, you stopped smoking and you bargained for more safe steel plants. If you hadn't done that, we'd be okay. But I am being facetious. But the fact of the matter, that's very real, and that's good. That's good news.
We have one last question that we can take.
Jim, it's good to see you contributing to the public sphere in such a meaningful way post the magic 65 retirement age just a few weeks ago. And the question I'm going to ask is about the math as you've been crunching through it. What happens if we just say people don't retire at 65? You know, 67, 70, 75, teachers don't have a plan that means that they're going to retire at 58 or whatever, you know, they retire at 60. What does this start to look like? Is it a crisis still?
Well, I mean, obviously, if people retire or work one more year, that's effectively 2 years in the equation because you've got one more year of contributions and one less year that you're paying out. So clearly that helps mathematically. And also the fact of the matter is people are healthier and they are living past, or they are working past their kind of first out date. Again, if I use teachers as an example, where they have a factor 85, they're not retiring the moment they hit factor 85. It is, a few years later. As long as they're enjoying, as long as they're healthy, as long as they're enjoying their job, all the polling that we've done with employee groups say, I'm gonna stay. I'm enjoying myself. I'm healthy. I'm also seeing that in other sectors where even though they have a low factor to retire, they're staying on far longer. But if people can be encouraged to do that, if it's safe, if they're in a type of occupation, because many occupations, are pretty tough on the body and they can't necessarily work that much longer. But if we can encourage that, that is very healthy. And generally speaking, I think most working people do enjoy staying on the job. There's all sorts of camaraderie and social benefits of that.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Just ask that you sit there for a minute. Please welcome Mr. Bill White of IBK Capital to send our appreciation.
Mr. President, distinguished head table guests, fellow members and guests of the Empire Club of Canada, I have the pleasure to express our formal thanks to Jim Leech and Jacquie McNish. Jim and Jacquie, what you did today, why you did it, and how you did it helps each of us to better understand and embrace Canada's pension crises. In your book, The Third Rail, Confronting Our Pension Failures, you state, if nothing else changes, it is possible, indeed probable, that all taxpayers will find themselves burdened with the expense of rescuing and providing for a generation of marooned and financially unprotected retirees. It is without any doubt that this statement resonates with everyone in this room. Whether you are the taxpayer or the unprotected retiree, you now know that Canada's pension crisis is a very big problem, and that Jim and Jacquie, of course, have clearly addressed that for us today. Thank you, Jim and Jacquie, for offering recommendations, offering solutions and prescriptions for Canada's pension crises, and for providing past examples of successful pension reform that have been implemented by very courageous leaders. Please join me now in a special and warm thanks to Jim Leech and Jacquie McNish.
And just before we adjourn, as you may know, Mr. Leech has been very supportive of our armed forces through his work with the True Patriot Love Foundation or group. So we're delighted to have someone here that if he plays his cards right, he'll have a pretty healthy pension himself. Mr. Aaron O'Toole, who's the Member of Parliament and Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of International Trade, along with a group of members of our armed forces, members and veterans. So thank you for being here. At your table, you'll see that we have a number of upcoming events. The third installment of our Women in Power series is on Monday at the Arcadian Court. We have the Deputy Premier of Ontario and the Minister of Health, the Honourable Deb Matthews, speaking. I'd like to thank the TMX Group for sponsoring our event, PricewaterhouseCoopers and Bill McFarland for being our gold sponsor, IBK Capital for sponsoring our student event. And as we noted from the remarks today, it really is important to have young people at our events because a lot of this has a lot to do with you. So thank you for being here, and thank you, IBK Capital. I'd like to thank the National Post as our print media sponsor, and to the Globe and Mail for being our future sponsor, hopefully. to Van Valkenburg for providing our AV. This meeting will be carried and aired on Rogers Television. We are grateful to them for your support. We're on Twitter and Facebook, and we have a website where membership information is available. It's empireclub.org. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you again soon. This meeting of the Empire Club of Canada is now adjourned.